Alright, coming at you with another homework help video. This is going to be the 1920s documents 2, 5A, and 3. So let's go ahead and start with document 2. When we look at this one here, let's first check out our source because that's what we're trying to get used to. We've got a book here, Only Yesterday, An Informal History of the 1920s. That tells us everything we need to know. We're going to start talking about the 1920s. That's what we're reading about. Our question: what is one way middle class women's life changed in the 1920s? So we're looking for a way that women's lives changed in the 1920s. Well, let's take a look. And what were these own lives of theirs, which we're talking about women, to be like? Well, for one thing, they could take jobs. Up to this time, girls of middle class who had wanted to do something had been largely restricted to school teaching, social service work, nursing, stenography, and clerical work in business houses. But now they poured out of the schools and colleges into all manner of new occupations. So we got new occupations. They besieged the offices of publishers and advertisers. They went into tea room management until they're threatened to be more purveyors or sellers than consumers of chicken patties and cinnamon toast. They sold antiques, sold real estate, opened small little shops, and finally invaded department stores. In the 1920s, department store was in the mind of average college girl of rather bourgeoisie or middle class, if we remember that term from Global, institution which employed poor shop girls. By the end of the decade, college girls were standing in line for openings in the Mrs. Sportswear department and even selling behind the counter in the hope that someday fortune might smile upon them and make them buyers or stylists. Small town girls who once would have been contented to stay in Sauk Center, Minnesota, all their days were now borrowing from father to go to New York City or Chicago to seek their fortunes. In Bess or Macy's or Marshall Fields, married women who were encumbered or burdened with children and could not seek jobs consoled themselves with the thought that homemaking and child rearing were really professions after all. No topic was so furiously discussed at luncheon tables from one end of their country to the other as the question whether the married woman should take a job and whether the mother had a right to. And for the unmarried woman, she no longer had to explain why she worked in a shop or an office. It was idleness nowadays that they had to defend. So, one way that middle class women's lives changed, they were going into the professions. You got, 5 or 6 to pick from here. New occupations, they took jobs. They were publishers, advertisers, all of these different job listings here, right in the middle of the paragraph could be what you choose from. So now, what I want to look at is this last quote down here. It was idleness nowadays that had to be defended. They're calling out the Southern Belles here. Southern Belles used to kind of just hang at home, run the household. That wasn't an option anymore. As you can see, jobs were what women should be getting into. All right, let's tackle the next one. Document 5B, we have the Perils of Prosperity, 1914 to 1932. And our question here is, one economic problem of the 1920s. Let's get ready. Critics of big business in the 1920s emphasized not only the increase in concentration, but the fact that the benefits of technological innovation were by no means evenly distributed. That is the gap between the rich and the poor. They're calling it out right there. Corporate profits and dividends far outpaced the rise in wages, and despite the high productivity of the period, there was a disturbing amount of unemployment. That doesn't sound good. At any given moment in the golden 20s, from 7 to 12% were jobless. Factory workers were sick, or weak industries such as coal, leather, textiles saw a flush of prosperous times. Nor did blacks, African Americans in ghetto tenements, or Hispanics in the foul boroughs of Los Angeles or El Paso, or Native Americans abandoned on desolate reservations. The Laura Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina, site of a bloody strike in 1929, paid its workers that year a weekly wage of $18 to men and $9 to women for a 70-hour work week. Holy cow. At the height of the Coolidge prosperity, the Secretary of Gastonia Chamber of Commerce boasted that children of 14 were permitted to only work 11 hours a day. Could you imagine? Children permitting to work only 11 hours, just 11. Perhaps as many as 2 million boys and girls under 15 continued to toil in textile mills, cranberry bogs, and beet fields. In 1929, 71% of American families had an income of under $2,500. That was the minimum standard of a decent living. The 36,000 wealthiest families received as much as the 12 million families, 42% of those in America, who received under $1,500 a year below the poverty line. We got so many problems to choose from here. You can do the low wages. We had $9 to women, $18 to men. You've got child labor, 11 hours a day, massive unemployment up here, and you've got the gap between the rich and the poor right there. Anything you want to choose from. Let's focus on this part down here. This reminds me of a quote that we've heard before from the Gilded Age. Do you remember that 90% of the wealth belonged to 10% of what? That's right, the population. It's the same thing. It's happening over and over again. Remember that hamster wheel? So you've got a whole bunch of different answers to choose from in there. All right, let's look at this last one. Remember, we've got to read everything that's outside of the document. We've got Howard Johnson, an African-American newspaper editor. And if we look down here, he's interviewing Jennings and Brewster. So let's see, what questions are we looking at? One effect of World War I on the black community, and one factor that helped the black community in the 1920s. Okay. The time was ripe for a renaissance back then. After the defeat of the Kaiser in Germany in World War I, a spirit of optimism and expectation swept across Harlem. The Allies won the war for democracy, so now it is time to change. It is time for something to happen in America to change the system of segregation and lynchings that were going on. In Europe, the black African American troops were welcomed as liberators. So when they came back to America, they were determined to create a situation approximate to the slogans they had been fighting for. They wanted a democracy at home in the United States, and this general idea helped feed the concept of the Renaissance. A lot of people wonder how there could be joy and optimism in a community under the conditions of segregation and discrimination. The black community had two very important factors that enabled it to survive and grow. One was the church, where you had the gospel and the spiritual, which were inspirational in their basic content, and the other was the entertainment world, where you had music of the secular side expressed in jazz. Let's tackle the first question. One effect. Biggest effect here. The word that we need to look at is change. African Americans fought in World War I for democracy in other countries, but when they came home, they didn't have those same rights. So they're saying home needs to change because we just fought over there. And what's this Renaissance we're talking about? The Harlem Renaissance is what we're talking about here. African Americans pushing their culture, coming together, creating an even new culture that we had in jazz in Harlem after the Great Migration, that movement up to the north. So one effect, you could put the Harlem Renaissance, you could put demand for change, you got a bunch to pick from. One factor that helped the black community, well, they say one, and then they say the other. You had two to choose from. You got the church, or you have the entertainment world. Again, any questions, let me know. I hope this helped.